Jimmy Kimmel and Robert De Niro didn't just criticize Donald Trump. They stood on the same stage, on the same night, and delivered one of the most talked-about moments on television. What made it so powerful wasn't just the jokes, it was the timing. At a moment when late-night television was under intense political pressure, they chose to push back instead of playing it safe. And here's why this story stands out. Usually, when we cover moments like these, we're connecting comments made by different people at different times. But this wasn't that. Kimmel and De Niro planned this together. It was a direct collaboration, performed live before a national audience, while questions about free speech and political pressure were dominating the headlines. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. Jimmy Kimmel had recently returned after a suspension that left many wondering what would happen to his show. Across the media landscape, broadcasters were debating where the line between comedy and politics had been drawn. Instead of avoiding controversy, Kimmel came back with a message that was impossible to ignore, and he invited Robert De Niro to help deliver it. That decision changed everything. Rather than opening with a safe interview or a lighthearted comedy sketch, Kimmel used his return to make a statement. De Niro wasn't there just for laughs. He brought decades of experience and a reputation for speaking openly about politics, giving the performance far more weight than a typical celebrity appearance. Before we get into the skit itself, it's important to understand why so many people were paying attention. The atmosphere surrounding television had become unusually tense. Every joke, every monologue, and every public statement seemed to spark another political battle. Supporters and critics were watching every word, and the pressure on late-night hosts had never felt greater. That was the backdrop when Kimmel walked back onto the stage. Instead of acting as though nothing had happened, he leaned directly into the controversy. He acknowledged the moment, addressed the pressure surrounding his show, and prepared viewers for something they weren't expecting. Then Robert De Niro appeared. The audience immediately sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary guest appearance. The energy inside the studio changed, and it quickly became clear that the two had planned something much bigger than a few political jokes. Their performance mixed satire with pointed commentary, using humor to highlight concerns about power, free expression, and political influence. Whether viewers agreed with them or not, it was the kind of television that sparked conversation long after the cameras stopped rolling. And that was only the beginning. Because as the skit unfolded, every line built on the last, turning what could have been a simple comedy segment into one of the most discussed moments of the night. The message became clearer with every exchange, and the audience's reaction showed they knew they were witnessing something far different from a routine late-night interview. What happened next raised the stakes even higher. Canada has Donald Trump on edge, and the timing couldn't be more revealing. Just one day after appearing alongside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the FIFA World Cup final, Trump avoided any direct confrontation while cameras were rolling. But once the spotlight was gone, his administration struck back. Through U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, the White House announced a new round of 50% tariffs on a wide range of Canadian imports. At first glance, it sounded like another major escalation in the trade dispute. But once people looked beyond the headlines and read the fine print, the picture became far more complicated. Many products were excluded, while others seemed so oddly specific that they raised more questions than answers. It left many wondering whether this was really about protecting American workers, or simply another political message aimed at America's closest neighbor. Meanwhile, frustration with Trump's leadership continues to grow. Across the country, critics argue that America has reached a breaking point. They say it's time to reject politics driven by personal power and endless division. Their message is simple: no more leaders who put themselves above the country. No more unnecessary wars that drain American resources. No more policies that leave working families struggling while the wealthy benefit. For millions of Americans, these concerns aren't just political talking points, they're daily realities. Families continue to wrestle with rising grocery bills, expensive housing, soaring energy costs, and uncertainty about the future. Many believe Washington has lost sight of the people it was elected to serve. Before we dive deeper, thank you to everyone supporting independent journalism. Your memberships, subscriptions, likes, and shares help keep reporting free from corporate influence and outside pressure. Every bit of support makes it possible to continue covering stories that many larger outlets often overlook. Now let's turn to another story that captured national attention. Jimmy Kimmel and Robert De Niro didn't simply criticize Donald Trump from separate platforms. They appeared together on the same stage, on the same night, delivering one of the most talked-about political comedy moments of the year. This wasn't a case of two public figures making similar arguments months apart. It was a carefully planned collaboration that unfolded live before a national audience. What made the moment especially powerful was its timing. At the time, Kimmel had just returned after a 6-day suspension that left many wondering whether his career and the future of late-night political comedy was in jeopardy. The controversy had erupted after public pressure from the FCC chairman, creating fears that government officials were crossing a dangerous line into policing political speech. Rather than returning quietly and avoiding controversy, Kimmel chose the opposite approach. He invited one of America's most respected actors, Robert De Niro, to stand beside him and confront the issue head-on through satire. Together, they transformed what could have been an ordinary comedy sketch into a broader conversation about free speech, political pressure, and the role of entertainment in challenging those in power. We're going to walk through exactly how that moment unfolded, why it resonated with so many viewers, and how recent developments have given that performance an even deeper significance. Because once you connect all the pieces, this story becomes about much more than late-night television. It becomes a reflection of the larger political battles shaping the country today. To understand why this moment resonated so strongly, you have to look at what was happening behind the scenes. For weeks, many in the media had been asking whether political pressure was beginning to influence what comedians, journalists, and television hosts could say on the air. Kimmel's suspension became a flashpoint in that debate. Supporters argued it wasn't just about one late-night host, it was about whether public officials could intimidate broadcasters into silence. That uncertainty hung over Kimmel's return. No one knew whether he would play it safe, avoid politics, or simply move on. Instead, he did exactly the opposite. He leaned into the controversy and invited Robert De Niro to join him in a sketch that mocked the idea of government intimidation through comedy. The audience immediately sensed something different was happening. The energy in the studio shifted the moment De Niro walked onto the stage. It wasn't just another celebrity cameo designed to generate laughs. It felt like a statement. De Niro portrayed a fictional FCC chairman with the attitude of a classic mob boss, borrowing the intimidating style that made many of his film characters so memorable. The character wasn't subtle. Every line was designed to exaggerate what critics believed was already happening behind closed doors, using fear instead of persuasion to influence what people could say publicly. The sketch quickly turned into one of the sharpest pieces of political satire television had seen in years. Every joke carried a larger message. Instead of delivering a serious lecture about free speech, Kimmel and De Niro used humor to ask an uncomfortable question. What happens when people begin worrying about the consequences of speaking their minds? The audience laughed, but the underlying point was difficult to ignore. Comedy has always played a unique role in American culture. It allows difficult conversations to reach audiences that might never sit through a political speech or a news conference. By exaggerating real concerns, satire often exposes uncomfortable truths more effectively than a straightforward argument ever could. That was exactly the strategy Kimmel and De Niro appeared to embrace. Rather than telling viewers what to think, they invited them to consider where the country might be heading if criticism of those in power became something people feared instead of expected. As the performance spread across social media, millions watched clips from the show. Some praised it as a courageous defense of free expression. Others dismissed it as political theater. Regardless of where people stood politically, the sketch succeeded in doing one thing that every late-night host hopes for: it got the entire country talking. But while television audiences debated the performance, another story was unfolding that pushed these questions into an even broader national conversation. At the same time the comedy sketch dominated headlines, the Trump administration was once again escalating tensions with Canada. Following Trump's appearance with Prime Minister Mark Carney at the FIFA World Cup final, the administration announced sweeping new tariffs under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Officials argued the move was necessary because Canada had unfairly discriminated against American products through restrictions on alcohol, dairy, and vehicle imports. Supporters viewed the tariffs as a tough negotiating tactic designed to protect American businesses. Critics saw something entirely different. They argued that Canada was simply responding to earlier U.S. trade actions and that labeling those responses as discrimination ignored the broader context of an escalating trade dispute between two longtime allies. Once analysts examined the list of affected products, many were surprised by what they found. Alongside major industries were highly specific items that seemed almost symbolic rather than economically significant. The unusual list quickly became the subject of ridicule, with critics questioning whether the policy was driven more by politics than by economic strategy. The contrast was impossible to miss. On one side, the administration projected confidence, insisting these tariffs would strengthen America's negotiating position. On the other, opponents argued they risked creating unnecessary tension with one of the country's closest trading partners, while American families were already dealing with higher prices and ongoing economic uncertainty. As these debates unfolded, The questions raised on Kimmel's stage about power, accountability, and public criticism suddenly felt much larger than a single comedy sketch. They had become part of a broader conversation about leadership, government authority, and the direction of the country itself. As the political debate continued to intensify, Donald Trump was once again making headlines, this time over his remarks following the FIFA World Cup final. Standing alongside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney during the event, Trump appeared cordial in public. There was no visible confrontation, no heated exchange, and certainly none of the aggressive rhetoric that often dominates his campaign speeches. But once he was back in front of reporters, the tone changed. Trump complained about the wildfire smoke drifting south from Canada, claiming it had polluted American air and disrupted businesses across parts of the United States. He argued that if Canada couldn't control the fires, perhaps the U.S. should consider imposing additional costs, or even more tariffs to make its point. For critics, the timing was impossible to ignore. Rather than confronting Canada's leader face-to-face while cameras were rolling, they argued Trump waited until afterward to launch another public attack. It reinforced a criticism that has followed him for years, that he often saves his toughest words for press conferences and social media rather than direct conversations with world leaders. The tariff announcement that followed only added fuel to the controversy. Using a little-known section of the Tariff Act of 1930, the administration announced another round of 50% tariffs on selected Canadian imports. Officials defended the move by claiming Canada had unfairly restricted American exports through policies affecting products like alcohol, dairy, and automobiles. But economists and trade analysts quickly pointed out that many of those Canadian actions had come only after earlier U.S. tariffs. In other words, each side was responding to the other, creating a cycle of retaliation that showed no signs of slowing down. Then people started looking at the actual list of products. Instead of focusing only on major industries, the tariffs also targeted surprisingly specific items. Critics joked that the administration seemed to be fighting a trade war one hockey stick at a time. Others questioned whether these measures would have any meaningful economic impact or simply create another round of political headlines. Canadian leaders didn't appear intimidated. Many responded with humor, arguing that if tariffs on hockey equipment and swimming pools represented America's biggest strategy, then perhaps Washington had run out of stronger negotiating tools. Others said the real issue wasn't the products themselves. It was the growing uncertainty surrounding the relationship between two countries that have spent decades as close economic partners. For businesses on both sides of the border, uncertainty can be just as damaging as the tariffs themselves. Companies planning future investments suddenly have to wonder what policy might change next. Manufacturers hesitate before expanding production. Consumers begin paying closer attention to rising prices. And markets dislike nothing more than unpredictability. While all of this unfolded, another issue continued dominating national discussion. Trump's online posts became increasingly difficult to ignore. Throughout the week, he fired off messages attacking critics, defending his administration, promoting new policy claims, and responding to fresh controversies almost in real time. Supporters viewed the posts as proof that he was fighting back against what they considered unfair media coverage. Opponents saw something very different. They argued the constant stream of social media battles distracted attention from larger issues facing ordinary Americans: rising living costs, housing affordability, inflation, and growing international tensions. That contrast became a recurring theme throughout the week. While political leaders argued over tariffs, trade disputes, and social media posts, millions of families remained focused on much simpler concerns: paying bills, filling the gas tank, buying groceries, and wondering whether the economy would become even more expensive in the months ahead. And that's why the events of this week mattered beyond politics. The debate wasn't simply about Canada or another round of tariffs. It became a broader discussion about leadership, priorities, and whether political conflict was overshadowing the everyday challenges facing working Americans. As these stories continued unfolding, the comedy sketch that had sparked so much conversation earlier suddenly felt like just one piece of a much larger picture, one where politics, media, economics, and public opinion were becoming increasingly intertwined. As the political headlines continued to dominate the news cycle, the moment that many viewers couldn't stop talking about was still unfolding on late-night television. When Robert De Niro stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, the atmosphere changed instantly. The applause wasn't just for a legendary actor. It reflected the audience's understanding that this appearance carried a message far bigger than an ordinary celebrity interview. Instead of simply joining Kimmel for casual conversation, De Niro fully committed to a satirical role. He portrayed a fictional FCC chairman, a character who behaved less like a public official and more like a classic movie mob boss. The comparison wasn't accidental. Through humor and exaggeration, the sketch explored what critics feared could happen if government officials began using their authority to pressure television networks and silence voices they disliked. Every line was designed to push that idea to its extreme. Rather than delivering a serious political speech, the sketch invited viewers to laugh while asking an uncomfortable question. What happens when people begin worrying that speaking openly could come with professional consequences? That question resonated because it reflected concerns many people were already discussing following Kimmel's suspension. Throughout the performance, De Niro leaned into the intimidating personality that made many of his film characters unforgettable. Calm, confident, and deliberately over the top, his fictional chairman acted as though criticism wasn't something to answer, it was something to punish. The audience erupted with laughter. But beneath the comedy was a serious message. Political satire has always worked best when it exaggerates reality just enough to force people to think differently about current events. Instead of presenting statistics or policy arguments, it holds up a mirror through humor, allowing viewers to reach their own conclusions. That's exactly what happened here. The sketch quickly spread across television clips, YouTube channels, and social media, becoming one of the most widely discussed late-night moments of the year. Supporters praised it as a bold defense of free expression. Critics dismissed it as another example of Hollywood inserting itself into politics. Either way, the performance succeeded in doing something increasingly rare in today's media environment. It sparked a nationwide conversation. What made the collaboration especially effective was the credibility both men brought to the stage. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't commenting from a distance. He had recently experienced intense public scrutiny himself, making the subject deeply personal. Robert De Niro also wasn't new to criticizing Donald Trump. For years, he had publicly expressed concerns about Trump's leadership, often using award shows, interviews, and public appearances to voice those opinions. Because of that history, their performance didn't feel like a publicity stunt. It felt intentional. Instead of chasing headlines, they appeared to be making a broader statement about free speech, political pressure, and the role entertainers can play in challenging those in power. Whether viewers agreed with them or not, the sketch accomplished something many political speeches failed to achieve. People kept talking about it. And while Americans debated the comedy routine, another reality was unfolding outside the television studio. Trade disputes continued escalating. Political rhetoric became increasingly heated. International tensions remained high. At the same time, millions of Americans were still facing challenges much closer to home. Higher grocery bills, rising housing costs, expensive gas, and growing uncertainty about the economy. That's why this story became larger than a single television appearance. It wasn't just about comedy. It wasn't just about politics. It became another chapter in a much broader national conversation about leadership, accountability, free expression, and the issues Americans believe deserve the country's attention. As the week continued, those conversations only intensified, with every new headline adding another layer to an already complicated political landscape. And as you'll see next, the responses from both supporters and critics pushed the debate even further, turning one late-night comedy sketch into part of a much larger national story. As the debate surrounding Kimmel's sketch continued to spread, another question began to emerge. Why had this particular performance struck such a nerve? The answer wasn't just the jokes. It was the timing. The country was already deeply divided over questions of government power, media freedom, and political accountability. That meant even a comedy sketch could quickly become part of a much larger national conversation. For many viewers, the performance symbolized something beyond late-night television. It represented the growing belief that criticism of those in power should never be treated as a threat. Throughout American history, comedians have often challenged presidents, members of Congress, and public officials from both political parties. Satire has long been viewed as one of democracy's pressure valves, a way for the public to question authority through humor rather than hostility. That tradition was at the center of Kimmel and De Niro's message. Instead of arguing that anyone should be above criticism, they suggested the opposite: public officials should expect it. The sketch wasn't asking audiences to agree with every joke. It was asking whether criticism itself should ever become something people fear. That message resonated far beyond Hollywood. Across television, radio, podcasts, and social media, commentators debated whether political pressure was beginning to influence entertainment and journalism in ways many Americans had never considered before. Some believed those concerns were exaggerated. Others argued they deserved serious attention. Regardless of where people landed politically, one thing became clear. The performance had accomplished exactly what satire is designed to do: it sparked conversation. Meanwhile, the White House found itself facing criticism on multiple fronts. Questions surrounding trade policy, international relationships, and the administration's communication strategy continued dominating the news cycle. Every day seemed to bring another announcement, another public statement, or another online post that shifted attention from one controversy to the next. For many Americans trying to keep up, it became increasingly difficult to separate the headlines from the issues affecting everyday life. While Washington argued over tariffs and political messaging, families were focused on entirely different concerns. Could they afford another increase in grocery prices? Would mortgage rates continue rising? Would inflation finally begin to ease? Those questions mattered far more at the kitchen table than the latest political argument unfolding on cable television. That's why critics argued that constant political conflict came with a hidden cost. The more attention devoted to personal feuds and media battles, the less attention remained for issues directly affecting working families. Supporters of the administration disagreed. They argued that Trump's aggressive style was exactly what many voters wanted, that challenging political opponents, confronting the media, and taking an aggressive approach to trade negotiations demonstrated strength rather than distraction. The divide couldn't have been clearer. Two groups of Americans were watching the same events yet reaching completely different conclusions about what they meant. One side viewed Trump's actions as decisive leadership. The other saw them as unnecessary confrontation. That contrast has become one of the defining features of modern American politics. Rarely do major political moments produce broad agreement. Instead, nearly every headline is interpreted through completely different lenses depending on where people already stand politically. And that's exactly why moments like Kimmel and De Niro's performance continue generating attention long after the cameras stop rolling. They're no longer viewed as simple entertainment. They become part of a larger cultural debate over free expression, political power, and the future direction of the country. As more developments unfolded throughout the week, those themes only became stronger, with each new headline reinforcing just how closely politics, media, and public opinion have become connected in today's America. As the headlines continue to change, one question remains at the center of it all: are these constant controversies solving America's biggest problems, or simply creating new ones? That's ultimately for the American people to decide. What is clear is that politics, media, and public opinion have become more connected than ever, and every new moment adds another chapter to that story. If you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who wants to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.